A young mom picked up her son from the babysitter and headed home, but she never made it. Police launched an investigation and stumbled upon a series of unexpected clues and witness statements. But despite their efforts, the search for the truth dragged on for decades. And when the case was finally solved, it sparked widespread outrage because of some truly bizarre details. Stacy Ann Falcon was born on October 23, 1971, in Renton, Washington. She grew up in a loving family and had an older brother, but eventually, her parents split up. Stacy was a cheerful, outgoing girl with a big circle of friends. During high school, she met a guy named John, and they started dating. Soon after graduation, they decided to move to California, and a few years later, they welcomed their son, Jacob. But after spending several years in California, Stacy and John decided to move back to their hometown. Not long after they returned, their relationship started to crumble, and eventually, they went their separate ways. So Stacy ended up raising Jacob on her own. She got a job as a waitress, rented an apartment in a small residential complex, and worked hard to make sure her son had everything he needed. In the fall of 1994, Stacy was 22 and gearing up to celebrate her birthday on October 23rd. She decided to surprise her mom by stopping by with her son. Even though they lived in the same city, Stacy's place was pretty far away, and her busy work schedule didn't leave much time for visits. That day, they celebrated her birthday together, and later Stacy and Jacob headed home. 4 days later, on her next day off, Stacy went out to celebrate her birthday with friends. She left Jacob with a trusted babysitter and spent the evening hitting up a few clubs, having a great time. After midnight, Stacy went back to her son. She got to the babysitter's place around 1:30 a.m., grabbed Jacob, and went home. About 2 hours later, a newspaper delivery worker was starting his morning route in the same neighborhood. As he passed a short dead-end street, he spotted a parked car with 2 bodies lying on the ground nearby, a woman and a boy. He immediately called 911, and officers soon showed up at the scene with paramedics. It didn't take long for authorities to confirm that both victims were dead. Based on initial observations, the cause of death appeared to be gunshot wounds. Investigators also quickly identified the victims. It was Stacy and her son Jacob. Detectives began examining the crime scene, trying to piece together what had happened. Near the car, they found several bullet casings as well as Stacy's belongings, including her cell phone. Inside the car, one detail immediately stood out as particularly strange. Both Stacy and Jacob's shoes were found several yards away from the car. It seemed like the killer had deliberately taken off their shoes, but no one could figure out why. What puzzled investigators even more was that Stacy's wallet and jewelry had been left untouched, making robbery an unlikely motive. Another strange detail at the crime scene was the discovery of 3 white buttons that didn't seem to belong to Stacy. This led investigators to believe they might have been left behind by the killer. The car keys were found wedged between the door and the driver's seat. Nearby, police also discovered used tape. This led investigators to believe that the killer's original plan might have been to steal the car, leaving Stacy and Jacob tied up. But when the perpetrator couldn't find the keys right away, things may have taken a deadly turn. Once the bodies were handed over to the medical examiners, they confirmed that both victims had died from gunshot wounds. Stacy's body also showed multiple defensive wounds, indicating she had fought back against the attacker. This theory was further supported by the dirt on her socks and the trampled grass near the car. Investigators believed Stacy might have managed to break free from the assailant and even get into the car, but she didn't have time to drive away. The attacker pulled out a gun, shot both Stacy and Jacob, and then dragged their bodies onto the road. The medical examiners also found no evidence of sexual assault, ruling out that as a possible motive. After wrapping up at the crime scene, the police started canvassing the neighborhood, hoping to find witnesses. A few residents mentioned hearing a woman scream and gunshots around 2:11 a.m., but none of them had called the police. They explained that the area wasn't exactly safe and the sound of gunfire wasn't uncommon. Unfortunately, none of the neighbors could provide any additional information because they didn't see anything. With all the information they had, police ruled out 2 major motives: robbery and sexual assault. They shifted their focus to potential suspects within Stacy's inner circle and decided to talk to her mother. That morning, she was working her shift at a cafe when detectives showed up to deliver the horrible news. As expected, her reaction was devastating. Overcome with grief, she ran out of the cafe, sprinting several blocks before collapsing on the ground in tears. Once officers managed to calm her down, they began asking if she could think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her daughter. The detectives first learned that Stacy had once lived in the same apartment complex as the babysitter she had left Jacob with that night. However, Stacy decided to move out after hearing gunshots near her home one evening. Since then, she had been living in a different neighborhood but would occasionally leave her son with a trusted babysitter. Next, her mother mentioned that, at the time of her death, Stacy was dating a man named Rich. According to her, the relationship seemed pretty normal. Rich got along well with Jacob and spent most of his time living at his own place. The detectives went to speak with Rich, and he told them that he had spent the evening at a bar near Stacy's apartment complex. Later that night, while Stacy was still out celebrating her birthday with friends, he went to her place and fell asleep there as he didn't feel like driving back to his own apartment after a few drinks. Rich claimed that he woke up early in the morning and initially didn't think much of the fact that Stacy and Jacob weren't home. He assumed they must have come back while he was asleep and then left early without waking him. Rich denied any involvement in the murders and agreed to take a polygraph test. However, the results were inconclusive. The operator flagged several questionable responses, which kept him on the list of potential suspects. Even so, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Witnesses at the bar confirmed seeing him there that evening, and investigators couldn't identify any clear motive for him to harm Stacy or Jacob. With no solid leads, the detectives decided to dig deeper into Stacy's personal life. They turned their attention to Stacy's ex-husband, Jacob's father. He told them that on the night of the murder, he had gone out drinking with friends, then returned home, played pool with his roommate, and went to bed. His friends backed up his story, but just like with Rich, his polygraph results raised some red flags. Still, there was no evidence linking him to the crime. Forensic experts examined Stacy's car and all the belongings found at the scene, but they couldn't uncover any foreign DNA or fingerprints. With no direct leads, investigators were left at a standstill and had to dig further into the case. Not long after, they received a call from a local hospital about a suspicious man who had shown up in the middle of the night wearing blood-stained clothes. Detectives immediately went to question him and collected his clothing for DNA testing. The man claimed he had gotten into a fight with his girlfriend and denied any involvement in the murders. Despite his statement, police decided to detain him until the lab results came back. However, forensic testing confirmed that the blood on his clothes didn't belong to Stacy or Jacob. With no connection to the crime, the man was cleared as a suspect and released. Sometime later, detectives got another lead. They found out that before picking up her son, Stacy had stopped at a grocery store. When they checked the CCTV footage, they spotted a man talking to her. Unfortunately, they couldn't identify him, and the lead went cold. The next clue came from Stacy's phone. Investigators found that the last incoming call she received was from a man named Scott. When they went to question him, Scott told them he'd been home with his wife and kids that night. He also admitted that they had briefly dated in the past, but their relationship ended when Stacy found out he was married. Despite the breakup, they had stayed on friendly terms, and his wife confirmed that he was at home the night of the murders. Still, something about Scott raised eyebrows. According to Stacy's friends, he had once left her a $100 tip at the cafe where she worked. Considering Scott had a pretty low-paying job and a family to support, this gesture seemed unusual to investigators. As they dug deeper, they began to suspect that Scott might be involved in dealing illegal substances. But while this was an interesting lead, it didn't bring them any closer to solving the double homicide. Still, they didn't rule out Scott's involvement, direct or indirect, and kept him on their suspects list. For the next few weeks, police struggled to find any new leads. Then, something completely unexpected happened. 2 weeks after Stacy and Jacob's murder, officers found Scott's body stuffed in the trunk of an abandoned car. Scott's brother told investigators that on the day he disappeared, Scott had planned to visit a man named Vince. The brothers had a side hustle fixing up cars, and they had installed an expensive sound system in Vince's car, but Vince never paid them. So, Scott had gone to demand his money. That's why his brother was convinced that Vince had killed him. Police tracked down Vince, who denied any involvement. However, a search of his apartment turned up traces of Scott's blood, and investigators discovered that Vince had been using Scott's credit card after his death. Vince was arrested, and detectives working on Stacy and Jacob's case questioned him, hoping he might know something about Scott's potential involvement in their murders. But unfortunately, Vince had nothing useful to share, and this lead went cold too. For months, the case remained at a standstill. But shortly before his trial, Vince suddenly decided to plead guilty. He claimed that he had killed Scott in self-defense, saying Scott had threatened him. According to Vince, Scott admitted that he had killed Stacy because she was planning to tell his wife about their affair. Vince also added that he and Scott had been involved in selling illegal substances. Detectives, however, weren't quick to buy Vince's story. The timing seemed far too convenient. Just before facing trial for murder, Vince pinned another killing on Scott, along with allegations of criminal activity, conveniently framing his actions as self-defense. Still, with no other leads, police had no choice but to investigate Scott's possible connection to Stacy's murder. But the deeper they dug, the less credible Vince's story seemed. Scott's wife was adamant that he'd been at home with her that night and couldn't have been across town committing a murder. His brother also dismissed the idea of an ongoing affair between Scott and Stacy, saying Scott would have mentioned something like that if it were true because the brothers were very close. On top of that, Scott's brother insisted that Scott had no involvement in dealing illegal substances. He claimed they both made an honest living repairing cars. Detectives ultimately concluded that Vince's story didn't add up. It seemed like nothing more than a desperate attempt to dodge responsibility for his own crime. After that, the case went cold. Over time, it was filed away, and no real progress was made. The only person still searching for answers was Stacy's mom. She kept reaching out to detectives, but one by one, they either retired or got moved to other departments. At one point, she was told the case would be handed over to Seattle's cold case unit, but when she tried to contact them, she found out the unit had been shut down due to budget cuts. In the early 2000s, police received a lead on a new suspect. An inmate contacted investigators, claiming that his acquaintance, a man named Charles, had confessed to killing Stacy and Jacob. According to the informant, Charles worked with Stacy at the same cafe, and they both were allegedly involved in selling illegal substances. The story went that Stacy had threatened to turn him in, which supposedly led to her murder. The detectives found the story a bit far-fetched, but with no other leads to follow, they decided to dig deeper into Charles's possible involvement. They sent all the existing evidence back to the lab for analysis, hoping that modern technology might uncover traces of DNA missed during the original investigation. But there was one major problem. The lab was overwhelmed with other cases, and the detectives were told they'd have to wait an entire year for the results. In 2002, detectives finally received the call. Using modern tools, experts had successfully identified DNA traces on the gloves and duct tape found at the crime scene, and they had a match. But it wasn't Charles. Instead, the DNA belonged to an entirely different man who had never once been on the police's radar. That man was Jerome Jones, a name that had never come up in the case files before. Investigators started digging into his background and uncovered a long criminal history that went all the way back to his teenage years. Jones had been arrested for robberies, assaults, car thefts, and drug-related offenses. Then, in 1995, just a year after Stacy and Jacob's murders, Jones and an accomplice killed a businessman outside his home in California. In 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison. Detectives also discovered that, in 1994, Jones had been living in the same apartment complex where Stacy had lived before moving out due to safety concerns and where her babysitter lived at the time of the murders. Even more chilling, Jones had worked at the club where Stacy had celebrated her birthday with friends. Detectives traveled to another state to question Jones in prison, but he denied any involvement in the murders. Every following attempt to get him to talk led nowhere. Yet a direct DNA analysis confirmed that the biological material found on the gloves and duct tape at the crime scene belonged to him. However, there was a major problem. The DNA on the gloves and tape was considered circumstantial evidence. The detectives knew it wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction, so they requested an analysis of the biological samples taken from the victims' bodies during the initial investigation, which had been preserved in storage. The experts made a breakthrough in the samples taken from Stacy's mouth. They identified biological material that matched Jones's DNA. This not only further confirmed his involvement, but also indicated that Stacy had been the victim of SA. Soon, more evidence surfaced. Jones's DNA was also found under Stacy's fingernails, providing yet another link that tied him directly to the murders. With all the evidence in hand, detectives approached a district attorney to discuss filing murder charges against Jones. But they faced an unexpected setback. The DA wasn't convinced the existing evidence was strong enough to directly tie Jones to the double murder. So, he asked crime scene experts to reconstruct the crime scene using the new evidence, hoping to get a clearer picture of how Jones could be connected to the crime. What happened next remains unclear. For some reason, the case came to a standstill. It's unknown whether the DA's request for a crime scene reconstruction was ever carried out. But in the end, no charges were brought against Jones. Perhaps the investigators felt less urgency to pursue the case since Jones was already serving time for another murder, or they feared that the available evidence wasn't enough to secure a conviction. As a result, the case was shelved again, despite multiple DNA matches connecting Jones to the crime. But the saddest thing is, the police never informed Stacy's mother about these developments, even though she had been tirelessly pushing for any progress in investigation for years. Stacy's mother continued reaching out to investigators, but over time the officers changed, and she eventually lost contact with anyone responsible for the case. Determined to find answers, she began reviewing all the available information on the case with the help of her sister. This effort stretched over 15 years until, in 2017, her sister passed away. From that point on, Stacy's mother carried on the search alone, but every attempt to achieve justice led to a dead end. In 2019, a journalist from Seattle got interested in the case. He contacted Stacy's mother and began digging into the investigation. Eventually, he discovered that the police had matched DNA from the victim's body to Jerome Jones more than 15 years earlier. Shocked by this revelation, he was baffled as to why no charges had ever been filed against Jones despite such compelling evidence. When he shared this information with Stacy's mother, she was devastated. She couldn't believe that all this time, the police had a suspect tied to the case by multiple DNA samples yet failed to act on it. The journalist reached out to a former detective who had worked on the case during those years and asked why Stacy's mother hadn't been informed about the DNA match. The detective explained that the evidence seemed too inconclusive at the time to draw definitive conclusions. He also admitted that he had been handling numerous cases simultaneously and simply didn't have the time. The journalist then asked the district attorney the same question. He responded that it wasn't his responsibility to notify victims' families about case developments, so it hadn't even crossed his mind to reach out to her. Finally, the journalist compiled all the available information into a detailed article. The story caused a significant public outcry, almost instantly reigniting interest in Stacy and Jacob's case. When the new team of detectives reviewed the evidence gathered by their predecessors, they too were stunned that no charges had been filed against Jerome Jones and began preparing the case for trial. Around this time, things took a rather unfortunate turn. Jerome Jones, who was still serving time for another murder, was granted parole, even though he was supposed to remain behind bars until at least 2030. This created a sense of urgency for the detectives and the prosecution, so they rushed to bring charges against him before he could be released. By early 2022, they finally brought official charges, and Jones was arrested right after his release from the California prison. He was extradited to Washington and placed in custody while awaiting trial. Unfortunately, Stacy's mother did not live to see the day when the man responsible for her daughter's and grandson's deaths would be held accountable. She passed away just 4 months after Jones's arrest. Despite this, the prosecution was determined to see the case through to the end and secure justice for Stacy and her son. Based on all the available evidence, they presented their version of events regarding what had likely happened that fateful night. According to investigators, Jones allegedly attacked the woman almost immediately after she left the babysitter's house. He either forced her to pull over by threatening her with a weapon, or she stopped for some reason, and that's when Jones approached her car. Based on the prosecutor's theory, Jones's initial plan was to steal her car, but in the process, he decided to SA Stacy. He forced her out of the vehicle and tied her hands, but she managed to break free during the struggle. She ran back to the car, where her son had been sitting the whole time, and that's when Jones shot them both. After that, he dragged their bodies out onto the road, planning to drive off in the car, but he couldn't find the keys. They were wedged between the seat and the door. In the end, he fled the scene, leaving behind several pieces of DNA evidence. During the preliminary hearings in May 2023, Jones pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. As of now, the trial hasn't started yet, and Jones is still behind bars. But with the evidence they've got, there's little doubt about his involvement. If the jury finds him guilty, he's facing a life sentence. So, this case is finally coming to its logical conclusion, even if it took 3 decades to get here. The crazy part is, Jones probably could have been charged as early as 2002, just 8 years after the murder. But for reasons that still aren't clear, it took a full 20 years to bring charges against him. Even though Jones has been in prison the whole time, Stacy's mom spent years in the dark, heartbroken that she couldn't get justice for her daughter and grandson. And now, as Jones might finally be officially convicted of their murders, she won't be around to see it. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.